pleasure to introduce Reilly Costigan-Humes and Isaac Stackhouse-Wheeler, who translate as a team out of both Russian and Ukrainian. Their names are most closely linked with Ukrainian author Serhiy Zhadan, who is well known for both his writing and participation in the Euromaidan protests, and who is at the moment giving daily Twitter updates from Kharkiv. Together, Isaac and Reilly have translated Zhadan's Mesopotamia, The Orphanage, and Voroshilовgrad, which won the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Best Translation of the Year. The pair have also translated Dmitry Lipskerov's The Tool and the Butterflies from Russian. Today, Isaac and Reilly are joining us from New York and Tbilisi to talk about their work with Ukrainian literature. It's lovely to have you both here. First off, I wanted to start by asking you how you came to work with Zhadan, how the text came to you.
I guess we can start way back. So Isaac and I studied Russian together in college, and one of our professors was actually from Kharkiv, where Zhadan lives, and she recommended that I read Zhadan in the Russian translation. This was way back in 2009, and I became obsessed with him. Then I taught myself to read in Ukrainian a little bit to translate his work, and then we started pitching his work to various publishers, and then luckily Deep Vellum actually picked up Serhiy's novel Voroshilовgrad, and in 2015 they commissioned Deep Vellum, Will Evans at Deep Vellum commissioned a translation from Ukrainian into English, and then that led to Mesopotamia and the Orphanage, two other novels by Serhiy Zhadan, and we've had very close partnership with Serhiy throughout the years when he's come to the U.S. to present his translations, and before, in the pre-pandemic days, he would come, once or twice a year, and we would help. We would help with these events also. So,
Fantastic. Thank you. I know obviously you've translated Lipskerov as well. Would you be able to talk a little bit about your experience between sort of pitching a Ukrainian writer versus a Russian writer, or how did The Tool and the Butterflies come to you? Was that something that you actively pitched?
The Tool and the Butterflies was a book that came to us rather than one that we chased down in the way we chased down Voroshilовgrad. It was a situation where there was pre-existing interest in the book, and we were approached to translate it. Fortunately, that proved to be a really positive turn of events for us. Lipskerov is a fascinating author. There's no one who quite writes like him. So the fact that we were able to have him discovered for us was good fortune for us.
No, absolutely. So I wanted to ask, are you pitching other Ukrainian authors or Russian authors at the moment? Is that something that you're actively engaged in?
So in terms of, we have another Ukrainian author that we've translated, Andrei Lyubka. We translated one of his novels, Carbide, into English, and we translated several of his short stories into English. And at the moment, we would like to translate another Ukrainian author. We won't disclose that information until we actually receive a book deal, but to talk about it in more general terms, there has been a spike in interest in regards to contemporary Ukrainian literature, given that didn't just start in February 2022, but it started several years ago, actually, because people started to acknowledge that contemporary Ukrainian authors have a lot to offer, and American and basically English language publishers have made more of a distinct effort to highlight what Ukrainian literature is all about, and I think that's also the main difference when you're pitching novels. Of the reason why we chose Lyubka's work was that it gave readers a relatively good understanding of certain societal issues that were at play in 2015 when he wrote the novel. And someone who knew very little about Ukraine and Ukrainian history and just the Ukrainian language could pick up his novel and learn a great deal, even though it's fiction. And there's more of a sense of responsibility to do that with Ukrainian literature. People understand roughly what Russian literature is. Some have suffered through the Russian classics. Others have had some sort of exposure to Russian literature, and you don't necessarily need to provide as much context, or you don't need to select authors that will show or showcase what Russian literature, contemporary Russian literature is. But with Ukrainian literature, you have to almost accomplish, you have to wear two hats. You have to focus on the literary merit of the knowledge, of literary merit of the work, and then also some sort of social and political context that sheds light on what Ukraine is today, or what Ukraine has been at some point, which makes pitching novels actually easier to a certain extent. Isaac, why don't you expound upon that?
Oh, I'd like to touch on a different idea you raised, if I may. You mentioned the sense of responsibility that comes with translating Ukrainian literature. I found that that sense has become even more pronounced given the times we're living in, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The other side of our translation work, beyond pitching actual novels, is pitching shorter literary translations for journals, and that sense of responsibility has really governed how we've gone about that recently. I'm currently translating two poets that I'm pitching to literary journals, one of whom is Ukrainian and one of whom is Russian. And choosing to translate a Russian poet at this moment was not a self-evident thought process in the way that it would have been in the past. Doubly so pitching a Russian poet. I actually, as I sat down to translate Alexei Porvin, the anti-war Russian poet that I'm currently working with, I checked Facebook before I got to work, as many of us do, and doubly so in times like these when we see history playing out on our feeds. And I saw a Ukrainian poet from a besieged city writing about how she sees Russian writers being translated with their hot takes about what's going on in Ukraine. And I apologize for the crude language, but I feel it was important. She said, "I see this and I don't fucking like it." And honestly, she had every right to feel that way. And when I was electing to translate an anti-war Russian poet, I felt that I had to hold myself responsible to this woman who was writing from a besieged city, and others like her who don't want to see translators of Russian literature taking advantage of this situation to aggrandize their artists at the expense of Ukrainian writers who need now more than ever to be translated. So the reason I elected to go ahead with translating and pitching this new poem by Alexei Porvin was that it was an explicitly anti-war and anti-Putin poem. And on that basis, I felt that it was important to translate it and see it platformed. But it was not a straightforward thought process in the wake of the invasion in the way that it would have been before.
No, I can completely understand that. And I think in this sense, you're almost using, well, you're using your abilities and your connections as a translator as a form of activism and to support Ukraine, which is absolutely, I think, the role that literary translation can play right now. Could you speak about what you think we can do to increase visibility? Obviously, you're doing so much towards this already, but to further increase visibility of Ukrainian literature and to sort of continue this visibility on in the future, and not hopefully it's not just now.
Isaac, why don't you go for it?
The problem with translating literature from not just from Ukraine or from Russia, but from the entire post-Soviet space, is that many readers in the English-speaking world treat reading those books as a political activity rather than a literary one. Obviously, I'm not proposing that literature can be viewed as apolitical or translation can be viewed as apolitical. Obviously, that's absurd. But the political power of literature is rooted in its aesthetic and cognitive power. It's that's why a novel with political themes is more powerful than an essay with political themes so often, because it has that aesthetic and cognitive power behind it. I think it's important as translators and readers who are interested in experiencing and promoting literature from that part of the world that we don't lose touch with the fact that it is first and foremost literature. It is first and foremost an aesthetic experience. When we talk about why Serhii Zhadan is worth translating, we need to remember that it's not just a question of his political activism or the fact that he is depicting an ongoing historical situation where the stakes couldn't be higher. It's the way that he's able to do so in aesthetic terms. The fact that The Orphanage is written with the precise perspective that Zhadan chose, the perspective of a Ukrainian teacher who speaks Ukrainian in his classroom and Russian in the hallway. The fact that his perspective is so intimate and yet so narrow that there are facts about this character we only learn at the end of the novel is what makes it so effective. It's not the mere fact that it was written by a politically active contemporary Ukrainian.
Well, and that's another thing with Zhadan's novel, The Orphanage. I first took a deep interest in Russian literature because I read Solzhenitsyn in high school and in college. And looking back on Solzhenitsyn's prose, you start to realize that a lot of the power behind his novels is the political context, not necessarily the prose itself. If you were to divorce the novel from the political context and shedding light on the horrors of the Soviet system, you would realize that the novels, a lot of his work is not necessarily astoundingly beautiful literature in its own right. With why we are so attached to Zhadan specifically, and other potential Ukrainian authors that we have translated excerpts for, or we've done translate short stories, is because we realize that their work will kind of last beyond these particular events, and you could read it solely as a work of fiction and not try to investigate any sort of political context, and you could relish this reading experience. And I think striking a balance between the two is a way that we will actually provide more of a platform for Ukrainian authors and more a platform, a level platform for authors from anywhere in the post-Soviet countries, that these authors aren't necessarily just interesting because they are shedding light on Stalin's repressions, for example, but the experiences these characters have in this historical moment sheds light on just the human condition as a whole, no matter how pretentious that may sound. But that's why we tend to cling to the prose and keep the political in mind. But that was the same with Lubka's work about smuggling in Western Ukraine. It was just a good story, even though there is the political context of Ukraine's EU aspirations. But it's a nice story you would want to hear from someone who has a perspective on life in Transcarpathia. So. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I don't know if I have time to ask you this question, so it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd love you to speak all day. I just wanted to know at the sort of the current moment, have you noticed that a concrete sort of uptick in interest from larger publishers in signing or accepting pitches from Ukrainian literature?
Well, there's a lot of preliminary interest. There's a lot of preliminary interest. Also, there has been just a lot more press and a lot more articles on Ukrainian literature and a lot more reviews and just a lot more people reading Ukrainian literature. For us personally, that hasn't necessarily led to commissions, but I think that over the course of the next few years, we will see that. It's just a matter of putting in the time and effort for everyone involved in the process. But it seems as though readers are craving a Ukrainian perspective and someone who's on the inside. And that will eventually contribute to more translations from Ukrainian or from Russian by just Ukrainian Russophone authors also, which is another thing that we can't neglect, just because someone like Kurkov, for example, chooses to write in Russian, doesn't necessarily mean he isn't a Ukrainian author. That and I think just presenting a Ukrainian perspective, no matter what language the author decides to write in, is important. And there's also been interesting cases of authors who've switched. Rafienko switched from Russian to Ukrainian, and his novel actually just came out. Yeah. So I'm sorry, Isaac, go if you want to say something.
No, please continue.
No, that was I was losing my train of thought at a certain point.
It didn't sound like it. It sounded very lucid.
Okay, all right.
I mean, do you think then? I mean, at the moment, obviously, you've got like Deep Vellum. And obviously, they've published Mesopotamia as well as Bereshitograd.
Mesopotamia was published by Yale University Press.
Okay, right. Thank you. I was just wondering whether the fact everything that's happening just now will lead to people like Penguin Random House or larger publishers, more commercial publishers picking up Ukrainian literature. And I wonder how you would feel about that. How that would.
That would be fantastic, but I think we need to temper our optimism about translated literature. I think that if there were a novel that was maybe a little bit politically heavy-handed, then there's a good chance that a more mainstream publisher could pick it up. Maybe I'm just pessimistic, but I think that with a lot of the contemporary Ukrainian literature that we encounter today, it doesn't feel quite mainstream enough that bigger publishers would want to pick up these titles consistently. Maybe like one like a one-off publication could happen, but or could happen every once in a while. But I'm not necessarily terribly optimistic about Ukrainian literature becoming this mainstream phenomenon that you're going to see people riding the subway in New York, reading, have beach reads from Ukraine. Like, I don't think so. But who knows? Isaac, what do you think?
I agree that we need to temper our expectations. It's obviously, as translators, our goal is to ensure that Ukrainian literature reaches as many readers as possible, but the level of risk aversion that you're going to encounter from big mainstream publishers is a very large boulder to try and move. And much as we would like to see Ukrainian literature reaching those broader audiences, it's going to require a great deal of grunting and straining from translators to move that boulder. Not that we're unwilling to do so. We expect to be doing it, for the foreseeable future, but it's going to be a long process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think also this, the last thing I wanted to note about after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think anyone who's trying to promote Slavic literature in general and Ukrainian and Russian literatures has to realize that we need to stop trying to couple them, at least for the time being. And I think we need to view them as separate categories, which I think the natural tendency, especially now, is to say, well, there are pro-Ukrainian Russian language authors who are presenting this issue. Let's bring them together with their Ukrainian colleagues. I have only noticed on social media and in terms of articles that this is infuriating for Ukrainian intellectuals and writers. I think I saw a quote by a very level-headed Ukrainian professor in the United States saying that the idea of bringing Russian scholars or Russian intellectuals together with Ukrainian intellectuals and scholars and writers at the moment is like this idea of we're going to all gather around the campfire and sing Kumbaya, and it's all going to be better. I think we need to take a step back and realize that, unfortunately, a lot of Russian culture and literature at the moment is very deeply entrenched in Putin's Russia. Unfortunately, I'm speaking as someone who's lived in Russia for his whole adult life since 2011. I think we all want to say to ourselves that Russian culture is completely divorced from the Russian government and Russian government's actions, and we can reconcile Ukrainian literature and Russian literature. I think we need to pause on that for the time being and try to avoid doing so, or present these as two very different perspectives, like Isaac tried to do with Porvin's anti-war poem. It wasn't, Porvin is not the type of author or a poet who's trying to scream, well, Russians aren't all terrible, but just presenting his response to this, not in an effort to preserve some sort of moral purity, but just because he's hurting and he needs to express this. So I think solidarity at the moment is not necessarily a viable solution, but viewing these as two separate entities, which I think Ukrainians have really strove for a very long time, is being viewed as a separate entity, which unfortunately Putin has tried to negate. That Ukraine and Ukrainians can exist by themselves, not as an extension or as a response to Russia and Russians. So.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have